Hello and welcome to this guidance about the Heathland National Plant Monitoring Scheme habitat. I'm Ben Averis and I'm here just now to talk through a document that I've put together to provide basically a kind of illustrated tour through the Heathland habitat. Here's a picture of some heath in Perthshire. And yeah, there'll be a lot of pictures of habitats from a bit of a distance, and then a closer look at the species characteristic of these habitats, species that we need to know about for the purpose of defining the habitats and different subdivisions of the habitat. First, the silly poem. I write lots of silly poems about such things as habitats and mosses. This one's about heaths. Okay. Let's have a blether about the heather, colouring the hills, pink and bright in summer light, or brown when winter chills. Its leaves are short, they're sort of, don't know what to say, except they're small. I guess that's all I can think of just today. Some better time a light will shine and other thoughts will come. Blue sky stuff, off the cuff, making heather fun. But here now, I can't think how. So heather's little leaf is put aside for a boring guide to different kinds of heath. Written for those who, I suppose, leave happiness behind and choose to roam all alone with habitats on their mind. Well, that was a bit of a miserable poem. I quite like writing miserable stuff sometimes, just for fun. Well, here we can see some heather. And actually, first I should say that for the purposes of the NPMS, the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, this category, this broad habitat type called Heathland, actually refers specifically to the dry heaths, not the wet heaths. They go in with bogs in a different kind of broad habitat called wet heath and bog, or bog and wet heath, whichever way around you want to say it. So the main definition in NPMS terms here is that these are dry heaths in which at least 25% of the vegetation cover is made up of some of these dwarf shrubs, one or more of them. Very commonest one overall is heather on the left, with, as you can see, very short, tiny little leaves. Flowers are very small as well and very pale pink. It's extremely common in dry heaths, and it also gets into wet heaths and bogs and heathy woods. Bell heather is rather different. Its leaves are longer, distinctly longer, and they come in whorls of 3, and its flowers are bigger and a darker, deeper kind of rich pink. Lovely plants. It likes dry, acid ground mainly, so it's very common in a lot of dry heaths, not so common in wet heaths, only some of the wet heaths, extremely rare in bogs. Blaeberry or bilberry, we call it blaeberry here in Scotland, bilberry elsewhere. I think they also call it other names like whortleberry in southwest England. Totally different, bigger leaves that are not evergreen. They are evergreen in the heathers. Bigger sort of oval leaves with teeth along their edges. They can turn quite nice red colour in the autumn before they fall off for the winter. Stems, though, are always really distinct, and you can see in that photo the stems are green and they are ridged longitudinally. That actually gives a distinct similarity to broom, much bigger shrub. I don't think you would really mistake the two. The difference in size is enormous. Blaeberry is really common in a lot of our heaths, our dry heaths. It also gets into some of our wet heaths and bogs as well. And it doesn't tend to need such dry and sunny sort of places as does the bell heather just to the left of it. It can tolerate quite a lot of cold and even snow cover. The next two species to the right, cowberry and crowberry, are more cold tolerant again. In fact, you don't find much of them lower down in the warmer southern parts of Britain. Cowberry is sort of similar in a way to the bilberry blaeberry plant, but it's evergreen and it doesn't have so many little teeth on the edge of its leaf, and its berries go red, not that dark blue colour. Crowberry is quite easy to tell. Its leaves look superficially a bit like the leaves of the bell heather, but they're thicker tougher looking things, and they have that long white stripe running along the underside. You'll never mistake it. So yeah, those two ones are commoner in the north, and especially at rather higher altitudes. Now, one of the first things that we want to be sure of when we're looking at heathy vegetation is whether it's dry heath, as covered in this document here, or if it's wet heath or bog. And indeed, bogs can be really, really heathery as well, just as heathery and heathy looking as a lot of the heaths. So, important thing to know for this purpose is this list of a short list of species mentioned here in the middle paragraph on this page: cross-leaved heath, deer grass, purple moorgrass, the cotton grasses, common species, so common cotton grass and hairtail cotton grass, and bog myrtle. Pictures of these on the next page. In wet heaths and bogs, those species are common. In dry heath, they are basically rare. Sometimes you can get a little bit of something like deer grass or purple moorgrass or cross-leaved heath even in a dry heath, but it'll be very, very sparse. The great bulk of the vegetation will be made up of species such as ordinary heather or bell heather or bilberry, blaeberry. Also, bell heather is much more common in dry heaths than in wet heaths and bogs. It does like a rather drier kind of habitat. Wet heaths and bogs, then, if we see a lot of any of those, it might just be one of them in big quantity, or it might be a mix of them. Those species, cross-leaved heath, deer grass, purple moorgrass, cotton grasses, and bog myrtle, if those are quite prominent, then we're going to be looking at wet heath and bog. And by the way, to separate the bog from the wet heath, that'll be covered more in the in the separate presentation about bogs and wet heaths, but we can look for hairtail cotton grass and some particular mosses that are sort of big chunky sphagnum species, and they will tell us that it's bog and not wet heath. That's just a wee bit of an aside in the context of this one here, which is looking mainly at dry heath. So here are those species that we don't want to be seeing big quantities of them if we're classifying the vegetation as dry heath and therefore the NPMS Heathland habitat. Cross-leaved heath looks kind of vaguely a bit like that bell heather we saw a couple of pages back, but the flowers are a bit paler and the leaves are grayer looking. The leaves are in whorls of 4, not 3, by the way, and they've got little whitish hairs along their edges. Which makes them look grayer from a bit of a distance or even quite close up. So you'll never mistake cross-leaved heath for bell heather. Deer grass it's a kind of sedge actually, not a grass, and it has what might at first glance look like a whole load of thin wiry leaves that stick up in a tuft, quite a dense tuft, but they're actually not real leaves, they're all stems. The real leaves are tiny little scale things right down at the base of the stem, really quite a fiddle to see. In this photograph they look very obviously stems because they've got the flower heads at the tops of them. It's taken fairly early in the season when the flowers are right out and at their most conspicuous, and the stems are still quite short. But later on the stems will grow taller, the flower heads will get duller looking and eventually fall off, leaving just a sort of broken off tip, which actually you can see some broken off tips in the distance in that photo of deer grass. So we have to look for that, and we can tell then that they are stems and not leaves. If they were leaves they'd go gradually to a cleanly pointed tip. Purple moorgrass in the middle. It's photographed in kind of autumn time there, showing then that characteristic buffy colour, warm buff colour that it goes at that time of year. It's a big tufted grass with rather broad leaves that become narrower to the bases of those leaf blades. Not that many grasses do that. In fact, the leaves eventually, when they die back, they fall off. They break off because they're very narrow at their bases. And you get a sort of mat of old, pale, washed out, buffy coloured leaves in between the tussocks of the grass, and they're all very loose, and actually a wind can bring some of them up above the ground and blow them around. That might be why it's got its name, another name, flying bent. It's a nice grass. can be a devil to walk through if you get lots of big tussocks on very wet ground. The flower heads, you can see them in that photo, they're sort of branched, but the branches don't really stick out very widely, so the flower head looks quite narrow. The cotton grasses, the next two pictures, the common cotton grass has leaves a few millimetres wide and it forms tufts, and the flower heads have numerous cottony heads. Sometimes you find them all dangling down towards one side. The leaves are fairly ordinary looking, darkish, glossy green, and at the very tip, the last few centimetres, it's kind of a solid thing, triangular in section, is quite unmistakable. Hare's tail cotton grass, totally different. Leaves are very thin and wiry. In fact, they can look rather like the stems of the deer grass, but you can tell that they're leaves and not stems because they taper to a sort of clean, finely pointed tip. They're also a bit more kind of, they tend to get a bit more wavy and curly than do the stems of deer grass, which are pretty straight. In fruit, hare's tail cotton grass has a single white cottony head sticking up, as opposed to the multiple heads of common cotton grass that dangle out sideways or downwards. Hare's tail cotton grass is really a bog species. Bog myrtle on the right is like a sort of low shrubby kind of willow with leaves and stems that have a beautiful resinous kind of smell to them. Stems are rather reddish colour, and the leaves are a narrow oval with a few sort of irregular and rather large and widely spaced teeth towards their tip. Apart from hare's tail cotton grass there, which is specifically a bog species, the other ones on this page can all be found in wet heath and in bog, and none of them will be common in dry heath. So any kind of heathy vegetation with a good quantity of one or more of these species will not be dry heath. It'll be in the wet heath and bog category. Okay, these species are common in our dry heaths. Wavy hairgrass, probably about the commonest grass in dry heath, in the dry heath NPMS habitat. It has tufts of very thin wiry leaves, no more than about 1 millimetre across, and then the flower head is very widely branched when it's fully out. When it starts off, the young plants in the spring, the young flower heads look quite narrow because the branches are all held very close to the main stem, but later on they open out and you can see these little very delicate, rather wavy side branches and their own little branchlets with these silvery coloured spikelets at the ends of them. It's beautiful grass. The tormentil has yellow flowers with 4 petals, quite small yellow flowers, and leaves with 3 leaflets with a few big jaggy teeth at their tips, and you can get also 2 rather leaflet-like stipules at the base of the leaf, so it can look as if it's got 5 leaflets. Very, very common plant in all sorts of acid habitats, including heaths. The same can be said of heath bedstraw in terms of habitat, that is, obviously not the flower colour and the shapes of the leaves, because the flower colours here are white and they're very small flowers in little clusters, and the leaves are little tiny narrow oval ones in shape, and they grow in little whorls off the stem, little bunches, whorls of between 4 and 8 leaves at a go, and it's a low, very creeping little thing with this smooth texture because the stems don't have hairs on them, and the leaves have little hairs but they point forwards. There are other kinds of bedstraws, by the way, that have a rougher texture because they've got sort of prickly and backward pointing hairs on the stems and the leaves. Heath bedstraw really, really common in dry heath. Now, for the purpose of the NPMS work, the heathland broad habitat is divided into these 2 fine scale types: dry heathland and dry montane heathland. It's all dry heath. The great bulk of it is in the first subdivision, dry heathland. That's any kind of dry heath in the lowlands of Britain will belong here, and actually most of the dry heath in the uplands will as well, because it's not montane. It's got dry montane heathland is restricted to montane kind of places where climate is pretty relatively cold, harsh. It's mainly in the Scottish Highlands, but there are small areas of it further south. The further south you go, generally the higher up in the mountains you need to go to find montane heath. When you go right in the far north of Scotland, actually you can find montane heath surprisingly low down. So we aren't recommended to try to put an altitude threshold to the difference between the montane and the non-montane kinds of heath, because it wouldn't work. You could be pretty high up down south, but not in a properly montane environment. So there's some photographs, some examples. One of them actually just up the road, the top one just up the road from where I live here in East Lothian in Scotland. Some ordinary dry heath, relatively grassy one on the Lammermuir Hills. The other one, an example of montane heath. You can see how short it is because the climate is so harsh in those places. The plants can't really grow very tall. The way we can properly tell whether it's the montane heath or not is really more by the species composition and the structure of the vegetation, as opposed to altitude, because that's not a sensible way to do it. And so we'll be looking first in this document at the dry heathland category, the one that covers most of the dry heath that we find, and then we'll have a look at the montane one. Okay, the commonest dwarf shrubs here in the dry heathland fine scale habitat are heather, bell heather, and bilberry stroke blaeberry, whichever name you want to use depending where you are or whatever. See, I've coloured them in different colours, the titles there. Well, I like to have some colour, but also those colours are not without meaning, because the bell heather, I've given it a nice bright sort of pink, and the blaeberry sort of cooler green. And there's some sort of sense to that ecologically, because bell heather likes to grow in places where the ground is relatively dry, usually an acid soil, and especially where it's rather warm. It doesn't like it too cold. So south-facing slopes it likes a lot. The blaeberry, on the other hand, is really quite tolerant of cold and snow cover. So it'll do pretty well on places like north-facing slopes and growing higher up the hills. It's also more tolerant of shade than is the bell heather. The ordinary heather, Calluna vulgaris, grows right across the whole range, warmer places to really pretty cold ones. But when we're looking at our dry heaths, the relative proportions of some of these most common dwarf shrubs are useful to just be aware of, because the dry heath category, there's this dry heath fine scale habitat here, is hugely variable, you know, from low ground in the south of England to pretty high up in the north, you know, before we get eventually to the montane heaths, which are a bit different. So those are the three main dwarf shrubs. Here's some photos. Top photograph is heather with quite a bit of bell heather growing in it. That's on a relatively sunny southwest facing slope, quite low down in the West Highlands. And the other one is in a cooler sort of place, higher up in Perthshire on a slope facing east. Not quite so, not quite such a sunny sort of aspect. And not surprisingly, there's a lot of blaeberry growing in with the heather, and I can't see any bell heather in there. And you can get some in between. Here's some heath that's got a mix of all three, the ordinary heather and the bell heather and the blaeberry. That's in Argyll at reasonable low altitude. When you get right in the far west, the further west you go in Britain, you do tend to get a bit more bell heather in a wider range of habitats, because the further west you go, winters are a bit milder and it's a more oceanic climate with less variation through the year, and that's quite favourable to the bell heather, which itself is an oceanic species on a European scale, whereas the vaccinium, the blaeberry, is not. It grows much further east as well on the continent. So it's not surprising that actually in the extreme west, in places like the West Highland, the bell heather can grow even on a north-facing slope, and in those places sometimes you have to get quite high up before you start seeing very much of the blaeberry. Another kind of gradient of variation that we can identify in these dry heaths involves some other kind of dwarf shrubs that help to pick out really that difference between the more cold and more northern examples and those further south, not just the balance between the bell heather and the bilberry stroke blaeberry. But some other species we've already seen in some earlier photographs, the cowberry and the crowberry. Well, they like it's cooler and you get a lot more of those further north and higher up. The other way around, further south, we can find some species of gorse other than the ordinary gorse. We've got the ordinary gorse, Ulex europaea, that is very common throughout Britain. But you also get western gorse, Ulex gallii, and dwarf gorse, Ulex minor, growing further south. The Ulex gallii western gorse goes up as far as the extreme south of Scotland. The Ulex minor, the dwarf gorse, is incredibly southern, except for an outlying population of it in a few places in the far north of Cumbria. Rather odd that. They're smaller things than the ordinary gorse, with some rather subtle differences in the flowers, and also the flowering time is they're more specific, sort of late summer flowering gorses. Here they are, the ordinary gorse on the left, and then the other two southern species on the right, and this points out the differences between them, sort of to do with details of the flowers and some of the differences in the leaves as well. I won't go into that in great detail here, but it's maybe handy just to see these pictures, and you can see actually the slightly shorter looking leaves, even without the flowers present on that dwarf gorse on the right. There's something rather different about these short little spiky leaves all sticking right out up the stems. They look sort of almost like kind of slightly furry, you might say, with a kind of texture that you don't really pick up in the ordinary gorse. Here's some heath with western gorses in Wales, in what is otherwise an ordinary looking heather and bell heather kind of heath on a south facing slope, or southwest facing slope. So it's kind of like a heather bell heather heath with added western gorse. Gives it a lot more colour. These southern heaths can look really attractive with that mixture of pink and purpley pink and yellow. Here's another one down south. This is in Shropshire actually. It looks a bit similar in some ways to the previous one. We've got bell heather in there and the western gorse, a lot of western gorse. But it's different in that it's also got the paler pink flowers of cross-leaved heath, and there are a lot of leaves of purple moorgrass, Molinia, scattered through it as well. The bulk of the vegetation is actually the western gorse and bits of ordinary heather and bell heather, but there's enough of the cross-leaved heath and the purple moorgrass that it's sort of halfway really towards a wet heath. Also down south, further south, this here is on Exmoor. If we're down in the far southwest, we can find this species of grass, bristlebent, Agrostis curtisii, growing in both dry and wet heaths, and it looks a bit like wavy hairgrass, the Deschampsia flexuosa that we had a picture of earlier, but we had a picture of just its flower head, not its leaves. The leaves of the wavy hairgrass look a bit like the leaves of this Agrostis in this photo, except the Agrostis leaves tend to be a bit stiffer and straighter. and there's also a difference in the flowering head, which has much smaller individual little florets in it, and they're more numerous. It's more kind of intricately, more richly branched is that flower head. And the whole plant is a bit of a greyer green. It's really very restricted in its distribution. It's really southwest England, Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Dorset, and the extreme south of Wales as well. So here it is growing in some dry heath on Exmoor, not really at the time when all the dwarf shrubs are in flower. Hence, it's not a very bright looking bit of heath. And here's that dwarf gorse again, Ulex minor in Berkshire in the middle of summer with bell heather. There's a bit of the gorse in flower there. And here it is again without flowers, but you can see the small size of that dwarf gorse and the bell heather still there, and some ordinary heather. This is a rather grazed example of some dry heath, some lowland dry heath, so it's rather grassy. We'll talk more about grazing a bit later on. So it's a rather nondescript looking heath, and it's not very colourful. The gorse isn't really, not much of it in flower. None of the dwarf shrubs are in flower much, but you look close and you can identify them by their stems and their leaves and tell it's a heath. So those last lot there, they were southern heaths with these yellow flowering gorses in them, and we were looking at dry heaths there, although those gorses can also grow in wet heaths. Here we're seeing a kind of heath that are rather damper, as you can tell by that red coloured sphagnum. That's moss called Sphagnum capillifolium. You know, sphagnum mosses, you probably know sphagnum mosses grow mostly in damp to wet places, such as bogs and various kinds of rush mires and sedge mires. You can get them in heaths as well, wet heaths, and funnily enough, even in dry heaths. So if you find a heath, a heathery vegetation with a lot of sphagnum in it, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not in a dry heath, because there's a form of dry heath found mainly on north-facing slopes in upland areas that actually has a lot of this particular kind of sphagnum. And it's a pretty interesting kind of heath as well, because in the far northwest, especially the West Highlands and the Hebrides, it can have a whole load of special western, quite rare liverworts growing in it as well. So we know that this heath here that we're looking at is not a wet heath, because it's got next to nothing in the way of deer grass or purple moor grass or cross-leaved heath or cotton grasses or bog myrtle. It's mostly heather with a few other kinds of grasses we can see in there. But the scarcity or absence of those wet heath and bog type of species means this is a dry heath, in the dry heath category, even though it's damp enough to have that sphagnum. And here, actually, just out of interest, are some of those rare liverworts. If you're ever going up to the Northwest Highlands or the Hebrides, also the west of Ireland, you get it on the mountains there. You can find on some of the north-facing slopes, especially where it's quite rocky, some heath with a lot of heather and blaeberry in them, and these relatively large and beautifully coloured leafy liverworts. There are many species, and they grow together, forming a little kind of community of their own. And you can see some of that red sphagnum in the middle and right-hand photographs there as well. They're quite incredible plants, and funnily enough, they grow. They're very restricted in Europe to this extreme northwestern fringe. You get a little bit of some of them in the far west of Norway and the Faroe Islands as well. But on a world scale, to start seeing them again elsewhere, you've really got to go to places like the Himalayan foothills or the far west of British Columbia, over on the other side of the world, where the climate is, in the right kind of places, is actually remarkably similar to what we get in the extreme northwest of Britain, cool and very, very rainy. Another kind of form of the dry heath still within the big main dry heathland fine-scale habitat type, not montane, is what we find along coastlines, which can be either on a kind of mineral soil or rocky ground, as in the photo on the left, or it can be on sand, as in the right-hand pair of photos. There's a lot of species can be shared between those two soil types, like heather, for example, and bell heather. But the examples on sand tend to have the sand sedge growing in them. There's a close-up photo of it on the right. It's a funny kind of sedge. It has an underground rhizome that creeps there underneath the loose sand and then keeps putting up little tufts of leaves and flowering heads every now and then. So you can find it usually quite thinly scattered among the heather if it's on dunes, on sandy ground. The ones that aren't, the ones that are on heaths, coastal heaths on firmer ground, tend to have other species in them, like some examples shown there: sea plantain, thrift, and buckthorn plantain. They can be quite attractive looking heaths when those plants are in flower, especially the thrift. So we've seen quite a bit of variation among these non-montane dry heaths, and superimposed onto all of that kind of variation are the effects of land management, such as grazing. Here is some dry heath that's been grazed moderately intensively, and what happens the more they're grazed is that the commonest dwarf shrubs, the heather, the bell heather and the blaeberry, tend to reduce in their height and their amount of flowering and in their cover. That's because those plants are very palatable. And when that happens, there's more space left for the grasses to grow. And you can get a gradual, in fact, depending on how much grazing there is, you can get a heath becoming just a bit more grassy, or it can continue and being more and more grazed and actually turn into a grassland if it ends up with insufficient quantity of insufficient cover of dwarf shrubs to be classified as heath. Burning is another thing that very much affects dry heaths. Here's an example of burnt grouse moor in the East Highlands of Scotland. You can see that prominent patchwork of more recent and then older burns, different colours, different tones. Yeah, it really does affect the vegetation on a smaller scale as well. It kind of leads to a more uniform and species poor kind of heath, in which heather is the overwhelmingly dominant dwarf shrub species. If it's not so burned, or has never been burnt, then the normal situation is to find heather accompanied by things like blaeberry, bell heather, various other dwarf shrubs. But what can happen where it's been burned a lot, repeatedly burned, is that heather can actually end up as the sole, even just the sole only dwarf shrub species there, very species poor. Now, as well as the dwarf shrubs, we've got various other species of plants that grow in these heaths, in these non-montane dry heaths. And let's have a look at a few more of these. Heath spotted orchid. If you find orchids in dry heaths, this is much the commonest one. Pale, rather short spikes, blunt-topped spikes of flowers. They can be almost white actually, or pale pink, spotted leaves. The petty whin, that's actually another kind of dwarf shrub really. It's related to gorse and broom. It's got little prickles on its stems. It's very short, low-grown species. It's not that common. It has a rather patchy distribution in this country. Bright yellow flowers in the spring. And the heath milkwort, if you find milkworts with their sort of bluish or mauve flowers in heath, they're most likely to be this one. There's another species called common milkwort, which is a bit bigger. It grows on soils that are not so acidic, and you can always tell which one it is if you're in doubt by looking at the lower leaves down the stem, and if they're in opposite pairs, it'll be this one, the heath milkwort. If they're not, if they're more kind of like alternate or just singly arranged along the stems, then it's the common milkwort. But heath, common milkwort's not something you find much at all in the dry heaths or any kind of heaths in this country. Okay, well, let's turn our attention now to the montane heaths, the dry montane heathland fine scale habitat. This, as I've mentioned already, we find this in pretty harsh environments where it's quite a bit colder, more windy, and the soils are pretty patchy and thin and very nutrient poor, as they are really through heaths in general, but particularly in these montane places, quite leached soils in the harsh and wet climate. Vegetation then tends to be shorter, as we see in the photo on the left, with some short heather. There's a bit of bell heather in there actually as well. And the photo on the right, which is at a higher altitude in a colder, even colder place, where there's the blaeberry kind of heath, that greener one. So there's variation, as we've seen in those two pictures just back there, heather and blaeberry heaths. The heather-dominated heath, here's another example, very short heather in a sort of wind-blown, very, very exposed place. These are among the places where heather gets to about its limits of altitude and about how cold and horrible a climate it can tolerate. And it's amazing actually that it can. It's amazing that any plants in a way can tolerate some of these really windy colds. If you're standing there in these conditions, these sort of, they can be summits or they can be shoulders of hills and ridges that pick up the wind almost whatever direction the wind is coming from. The really, really windy places, and so the wind just blows the heather very low, creeping over the ground. And there's quite a lot of space there where the heather hasn't been able to get a hold, and mosses and lichens fill up some of that, as in the case in this photo here. There's a lot of Racemytrium moss, that pale grey moss. Here in contrast, this is heath, montane heath, where there's little or no heather. There is some heather in the background in the left-hand photograph there, but it's mainly Vaccinium species, blaeberry, stroke bilberry, and also cowberry you can get here, and crowberry, the ampetrum. So these kind of montane heaths, which actually are the ones that go even higher up in altitude because they can be in colder places and places where there's more snow, these are of a greener colour. They can look really like grassland from a distance, but they've got a different texture, a more kind of granular looking texture because of the dwarf shrubs. Oh, another thing, point which I've mentioned in this text here, is how they overlap altitudinally with non-montane heaths. So it's not as if wherever you happen to be, where there's montane heath, that the montane stuff is always higher up than the non-montane. The effect of wind, for example, can mean that some very windswept cols have montane heath, and then you might go upslope a little bit to onto a more steeper bit of ground where it's sheltered for long enough, depending on the wind direction, that the heath there is actually not really of a montane kind. It's an upland, but not montane. So in that way, the montane can, in some places, be slightly lower than the non-montane. Another example of that is where you have little hollows in what is generally not quite up into the montane zone. So you're at the upper limits of the non-montane dry heath category, and you've got little hollows in there where snow lies for just that bit longer because they're little depressions and they're high up enough, and because of that longer snow lie, it's not so good for the heather, and you get some montane species that can take that kind of cold growing quite well in there. And actually the photo on the left is an example of that. It's a kind of dwarf shrub heath that's almost like a kind of snowbed heath, but a little bit further out from it, on a more kind of convex bit of slope where the snow doesn't lie so long, and there's more heather still able to grow there, and you're in a heath that's not actually a proper, not really a montane one, it's just a general upland kind of heath. Here's another one of those, what we call prostrate columnar heaths. This is the heather, in a place where it's very, very windy and it's blown, so that it creeps. It can't really grow, it can't grow upright very much. It's just creeping along the ground, usually away from the direction of the prevailing wind. In this example, there's a lot of lichens of the genus Cladonia, this sort of pale creamy colour. This is up in the north, up in Sutherland, and a couple of pages back, the one we had a photo of the very short heather heath, which had Racemytrium moss in it, was also up in the north. And there's a general pattern that the further in the far north, in the Highlands generally, actually, especially further north, the further west you go in these prostrate heather heaths, you tend to get more Racemytrium moss. Further east you go, you get more of the lichens. In fact, that pattern holds true for heaths in general, really. Here's a closer look at some of the montane species that we can find in these heaths. They play a role in defining the montane nature of the vegetation, as well as the structure of that vegetation, as you've seen in the previous photograph. I mean, just a look at that photo and it can't be anything other than a montane heath. But yeah, if you've got some of these species scattered through it, that makes even more of a case for it being montane. The one on the left, stiff sedge, it's quite a low-grown sedge. Well, everything's pretty low-grown in this zone. Rather broad, greyish green leaves. Particularly distinctive thing about it is that the stem is relatively thick and quite stiff. It likes acid soils. The next one, this is probably about this, what they might call the smallest. Some people say it's the smallest tree because it's a willow. It's extremely short, just a few centimeters short, just a few centimeters tall, I should say. Rather rounded leaves with sort of bluntish teeth around the edge. It's a nice little thing. The leaf as a whole is rather folded up about the central vein, so you get interesting light and shade effects and a kind of net veined pattern on the upper surface. Again, that tends to grow mostly on acid soils, including places where it's very rocky and very exposed. This next one, trailing azalea, it looks a bit like crowberry. If you haven't got the flowers, you know, you could be forgiven for thinking it was crowberry, and it would be pretty mean world if you couldn't be forgiven for such a confusion. When you look on the undersides of the leaves, though, you don't have that white stripe. That's one difference. Also on the upper side, see that groove running along the central vein? It's running through a little groove. That's quite distinct for this species as well. It's not very common. It grows particularly in really exposed places, maybe where the ground is quite stony as well. It's very, very short. Well, you can see it growing along with some low-grown heather in that picture. And then, yeah, it has these in the summer, these little bright pink flowers. Beautiful little thing. It's related to rhododendron, funnily enough, but it's a lot smaller. It would be great if rhododendron was no bigger than that, actually. Alpine lady's mantle, you never mistake that for anything else. Leaves all cut up in a star-like fashion. Underneath, they're kind of silvery, beautiful, silky, silvery texture. And that white silvery colour goes right out to the very edges, almost like it's trying to come out to the upper side of the leaf, but something won't let it. But at least it's showing itself there. We can just about see it. It gives a kind of silver, what they call a silver lining. I suppose it's a plant with a silver lining. That's actually quite common in the montane zone. It's one of our commoner montane species in the Scottish Highlands, and you get it in the Lake District as well. Some more species we get in these montane heaths. These are dwarf shrubs. These are great plants. You might think they're a bit dull to look at in that photo. There's hardly any flowers. The only flowers you can really see there are the flowers of the bell heather, which isn't one of the species that we're really talking about on this slide. But, you know, just the leaves of these things are great to look at. Nothing wrong with leaves. And in a way, that reflects another point about heaths in general. A lot of them are quite species poor, and the simplicity of the species composition of a lot of these heaths It's something that, well, I don't know, I quite like it. Something I identify with it somehow. The differentiation between the different heathland categories, if we're using something like the National Vegetation Classification, and when we're looking to try to understand the heath in terms of how it's affected by the climate, it's not always a case of looking for more of this species and this species or that species. We can be looking at vegetation that hasn't got very many species in it anyway, but things like the relative abundances of the species and the structure of the vegetation play a big role there too. Anyway, let's get on with these things. Dwarf juniper, it's a lot shorter than the tall juniper that you get in the East Highland pine woods and that you get also down in the southeast of England. It again just kind of hugging the ground. Leaves are quite obviously juniper-like though, in whorls of 3, and they're quite reasonably sharply pointed, but they're not quite as sharply pointed as the leaves of the taller juniper, so they don't hurt your fingers so much. It's actually a very sensitive plant to burning. If you find a lot of that dwarf juniper in a heath, it's most likely to be a short heath in a rocky place, and it's very much an indication that that bit of heath where it's growing probably hasn't suffered too much from burning. The next species, the bearberry, this is rather different. It's not strictly montane. It does grow well in the montane zone in many places, but it also goes down a bit lower into areas that are upland in climates. It's relatively cool, but not montane. And funnily enough, talking about burning, that's a species that can benefit from burning in a way where you've got artificial moor burning, like on grouse moors. When there's been a burn, the heather will obviously it will be shorter and not so dense, and this species, because it creeps low over the ground, it suddenly gets a bit of a competitive edge, because normally it can't compete very well with tall, dense heather. So for some years, then after a bit of a burn, it can dominate, or at least be co-dominant with the heather. However, we don't really need to have burning in order to keep a good amount of this bearberry in the Scottish hills, because it does also occur naturally in places that don't suffer from burning, but where the vegetation is kept open because it's maybe very rocky or stony or very windswept. The next species, Arctic bearberry, looks quite different from the ordinary bearberry. Its leaves are a little bit, they can get a little bit bigger, and they've got this funny wrinkled texture on the upper surface that makes them unmistakable, along with those teeth around the edges. And in the autumn, they can go a most brilliant red colour. It's much less common, and it grows mainly in really pretty exposed places, but you can here and there find it in the sort of almost in the montane zone, in slightly taller heaths and bogs, or in sort of reasonably dense bog vegetation up in the montane zone as well. It's mainly a montane species. And the fourth one, bog bilberry, this is a lovely plant. Those kind of glaucous, pale bluish greyish green leaves, and the way they grow along the stems, it looks like at the ends there's 3, almost like a clover, some just to do with the way they stick out. These are they're more like ordinary bilberry in that they do fall off in the autumn, in contrast to the cowberry, which is evergreen and they don't fall off. But this does look more like cowberry in that they are smooth around the edges. But you wouldn't mistake it for either, because it's that pale glaucous-y colour. And they go a dull pink in the autumn. The stems are browner and more rounded than the stems of the ordinary bilberry, which has those green ridged stems. Bog bilberry is a montane species, mostly found in heaths. It will grow in the very short exposed ones, but it's mainly in slightly taller, but still quite short, sort of heaths and bogs in the montane zone. Club mosses. These aren't real mosses, they're actually related to ferns. They're bigger than most mosses, and they've got a more of a tough, even rather woodyish sort of texture. Alpine club moss is a creeping thing found mostly in the montane zone, but it will get just below the montane zone in some places, but still upland. It's very much an upland species. So it straddles the first Heathland category and this montane Heathland category. Slightly bluish tinge to the leaves there is typical, and a lot of the branches are sort of clustered together, sort of arising from a place quite close, or almost one part of the stem, and spreading out in a rather fan-like kind of way. The leaves are like little short scales, pointed scales, quite unmistakable. It likes very short vegetation, that one, like in exposed places, but also some places where it's been grazed and got shorter, even shorter and more grassy. It can do well there. Fir club moss, the next one's unmistakable. Again, its habitat is both montane and sort of sub-montane, so again it straddles the dry montane heathland fine scale habitat and the ordinary widespread dry heathland habitat. Yeah, unmistakable. It's a tuft of shoots arising from a single place at the bottom. Quite strong texture. That one's got these sort of reasonable length of leaf. But so yeah, it's unmistakable. All the branches come from the base in a tuft. The next one, stag's horn club moss. This is quite common. It's again in both montane places and non-montane, and can go quite low down actually, even into rather artificially disturbed places like the sides of forest tracks. Creeps over the ground. It's branched, and each leaf ends in a reasonably long whitish sort of hair point, and that gives the whole plant a slightly woolly-ish looking, soft looking texture. So that makes it unmistakable, that white hair point. The final one, this is not so common and is mainly montane but in taller kind of montane heaths. And the sort of heather heaths that are almost montane, so it straddles montane and not montane again, but it's distinctly in very upland places. And it has the creeping and branched growth form of the previous species, the stag's horn club moss, but its leaves don't end in white hair points. The leaves actually look a bit like the leaves of the fir club moss. It's like someone's been trying to make a stag's horn club moss, but they've run out of leaves with the white hair points, and they've taken the leaves off the fir club moss and put those on instead. Yeah, it's an uncommon plant. It's a good find, that one. They're all good finds. More species that we get in the montane heaths. Mountain everlasting, unmistakable. Little low rosettes or little low tufts of these leaves, which tend to be widest at the middle or just above the middle, really. Like the alpine lady's mantle, it's got a very whitish silvery coloured underside, which shows up around the edges. So you can tell it in leaf, but when it's in flower, you have these little clusters of white or pale pink flowers. Grows in very open places, very short vegetation, or where it's a bit stony. Dwarf cornel, this is related to dogwood, has leaves a bit like dogwood. You know, those kind of veins that are side veins that are trying to get to the edge of the leaf, but they always curl around and they never get there. And the leaves are in opposite pairs, and each opposite pair is at right angles to the next one up or down the stem, so you get a sort of cross-like effect. The flowers are a kind of pale creamy white colour with a black centre, and then they go into berries. It's a beautiful thing. It's not very common, and it's in montane heaths and sometimes in montane bogs just about, but mainly montane heaths. And the same is true of cloudberry, which is a bit commoner than dwarf cornel, and it's in montane and not quite montane heaths and bogs. Related to bramble, it has fruits, flowers and fruits that look very much like those of bramble, except the fruits are a bit more orangey and don't have quite so many little berries on them, but they're edible. The leaves are different in that they're not cut up into leaflets like they are in bramble. They're a bit like sycamore-ish kind of leaf shape and with quite a wrinkled texture. So nothing else like that grows in these acid heaths and bogs up in the hills. So negative indicators in these heaths. We haven't seen these yet. Funnily enough, birch is counted as one which might seem a bit unfair because it grows naturally in a lot of these places, not in the montane zone, obviously, but in the non-montane dry heaths. And a lot of people are keen to see young trees regenerating in some bits of heath to get more woodland cover for a variety of reasons. So it's not quite so black and white there as to whether that should be regarded as a negative sign or not. Personally, I don't really think so. If the grazing is quite light, you can look upon young birch colonising some heath and look upon it probably quite happily. Bracken, maybe a bit less so, because it does tend to thicken up if it gets a chance and dominate and lay down a whole load of leaf litter which smothers the ground and can be a problem for other plants. Bramble, you don't get a huge amount of bramble in these dry heaths. Obviously not in the montane zone. None of these species here will be in the montane heaths. It can grow just about in some of the more lowland examples of dry heath. If there's not very much grazing, it can spread and come to be a bit more, gain a bit more cover, perhaps at the expense of some of the other plants. I don't see it as a great threat though in these places. Nettles, if you see a lot of stinging nettles, it's probably a sign, if you're in a heath and you see a lot of nettles, probably a sign that there's been some local nutrient enrichment, maybe by dung and urine from some animals, high concentration of sheep or cattle maybe, or fertilizer come off from some adjacent fields. So it's a eutrophication indicator. In a heathland environment though, nettles aren't very likely to increase and thicken up over a very big area. And the same is true of thistles. Again, they can indicate some kind of nutrient enrichment or ground disturbance, or a combination of both. Those things, the nettles, the thistles and the bramble and the bracken probably, but certainly the bramble and nettle and the thistle, whilst they are understandably down as negative indicators here in the heaths, I think they are more realistic negative indicators in grasslands, where they can cause more obvious trouble to the vegetation, to the flora. So we've seen a variety of heaths, including ones that I've written about in the text here as being warm or cool and happy, those ones with the the bright yellow of the gorses set against the pinks and purples of the heathers. What about sad ones? Is there such a thing? Well, in my view, I think burned heaths can be, if it's been extensively burned, because of the impoverishing effect that it has on not just the dwarf shrubs, leaving little more than heather, but also other species such as mosses and liverworts. A lot of those can suffer. So yeah, not really, in my view, the best thing. A lot of people will disagree. This is a bit of a contentious issue, of course. Overgrazing can lead to conversion of heath to grassland, which can be a problem. How much of a problem depending on where you are. A really bad problem, a bad thing to happen if it happens up in the northwest and you've got some liverwort rich heaths which get grazed out into grassland, and those rare liverworts can't grow because they're not getting enough shade and shelter and humidity anymore. Anyway, trying to be optimistic, the bottom picture on this page is decent heath. Some montane heath actually in Sutherland. It's a relatively low altitude, getting on for 400 metres, just a bit below 400 metres, I think. And then some bogs in the distance. And that's us. There we are at the end of it. There's a view of sylvan dry heaths on those steep slopes, wet heath and dry heath and bog mosaic in front. That's up in Sutherland. So I hope this presentation has been of interest, of help, or whatever. And yep, I'll say goodbye.